But before I introduce Kevin, I wanted to do two logistics announcements. One, please put your questions in the comments, and then at the end, I'll call you out to read the question if you want, or if you want, you can let me know for me to just read it. And also, it's very unfortunate that we weren't able to have the one-on-one meetings with Kevin, and he's our neighbor in Maryland, and would be great to have had those opportunities to chat. I wasn't sure about this new format and didn't want to add Zoom burden to anyone, but he would really appreciate meeting with us, and he's great to talk to. So I think the easiest thing to facilitate those would be if Rhonda puts her email in the chat, and just email Rhonda, and she could coordinate setting those up. And otherwise, hopefully we'll get to have Kevin up sometime in the when there's a vaccine era. And so I'm very happy to introduce Kevin Omland, who's a professor in the Department of Biological Sciences at University of Maryland, Baltimore County. He did his undergrad at Dartmouth, a PhD at SUNY Albany, and he's a proud Vermonter and a big skier, which I have seen amazing photos of. He also has recently been the University of Maryland, Baltimore County Presidential Research Professor from 2016 to 2019. Research in Kevin's lab focuses on the molecular phylogeny and population genetics of bird species to study speciation and character evolution. And if you haven't heard of it, his research on speciation reversal in ravens is really somewhat mind-blowing, and you should definitely check it out. But today, Kevin's going to talk about his research on female bird song, and building on that, a somewhat potentially unexpected turn in his research program, with a focus not just on the science itself, but on who does the science comes to influence how we understand the world. And this work's been getting some press recently. And so thanks everyone, great turnout. And I think you'll enjoy Kevin's seminar. Thank you for doing this over Zoom for us.
Well, thanks, Emily, and thanks everyone for tuning in, as it were. And as I was mentioning, I look forward to the day to be able to meet people in person at the lab, and but do reach out if some of the things I talk about today seem to overlap with some of your interests, or if you have questions you don't get to today. So I have the opportunity to talk to you today about an interesting set of topics that for the last 5 years, I've been on UMBC's STRIDE team for faculty diversity. And in that capacity, I was one of about 10 or 15 people from UMBC that was able to meet with UMBC's leadership about a year or so ago. So on one hand, I'm able to think about faculty diversity, and then I'm working on female birdsong. And today I'm going to be talking about where those two subjects have come together. And we're going to argue that this is a good case study. This case study of female song provides a really simple case study of how increased researcher diversity can lead to key scientific advances. And so I've long been interested in biases, and that I'm very interested in publication bias, for example, and what kind of how subconscious biases would affect me when I'm scoring mate choice in mallard ducks as a PhD student. And so we all bring biases to everything we do, both conscious and unconscious biases. I seldom get introduced as a skier from Vermont, but that's exactly what I am. So that brings a lot of bias with it. I was in the backyard. I was fortunate enough to have Baltimore Orioles come to the apple tree just right outside my back window. And so as a kid, for a couple weeks each spring to see those male Baltimore Orioles was spectacular. And I'm sure I chatted with my dad or mom about how that male was so elaborately colored, and how that female was much more muted. Older females can get a little more bright and orange. And females do sing some in Baltimore Orioles, but the male is known for this this beautiful song, which hopefully you can hear. I'll trust that you heard that, Emily. You can let me know if not, and we can work on it. But so people have long assumed that that elaborate coloration and that elaborate song first evolved in males in the context of attracting mates or fighting over mates. And so for those of us who grew up in the mid-Atlantic or in the northeastern US, this probably seems like a pretty typical songbird. But when we go to the tropics, we find quite a different picture. And so I've been studying this critically endangered Bahama oriole for the last 5 years. And so this is a critically endangered species restricted to a single island in the Bahamas. And I'll talk about that research at the end of my talk. And this is a species in which both the male and the female are elaborately colored. I gave this talk for a UMBC talk about a year ago, and the VP for research was the one who invited me, and he wrote me and said, Kevin, that's the same picture in the male and the female. Indeed it is. We have no pictures so far where we know the sex of the male and the female. We have genetically sexed them, but when we see them in the field, there's no way to know from seeing them whether that's the male and the female. And there's no way when you hear them to know whether that's the male or the female. So that could be a male, it could be a female. So most orioles have that kind of a clear whistling song. And near as we know, the male and female song are indistinguishable, though I have a new PhD student who will take that on. So a lot of the research that's been done on songbirds for the last 100 to 200 years has really been by a restricted set of the human race. And that has led us to a lot of our knowledge comes from these temperate zone species from the Northeast United States, for example. And if the knowledge had sort of begun in Manaus, Brazil, or in Cairns, Australia, or in the Central Congo, the way we think about the songbirds themselves might be different. So here's a picture of who has done a lot of the research on bird ecology, evolution, behavior for the last 100 to 200 years. So most of this work has been done by Northern Europeans and European Americans. So these two pictures tell that story. So 90% of the picture in this, people in this picture are white European Americans. There's 1, 2, 3, 4 women in there. So about 10% in the late 1800s. And so here's a picture in the late 1900s. And I was surprised by how little the picture has changed. There's about 20 or 30% of the people there are women. And I think by now our bird meetings are quite a bit more gender balanced, but clearly not a lot of ethnic diversity. Does anyone remember the 1900s? Everyone raise your hand if you were born in the 1900s. I think most of us were, but a lot of what we know really comes from the 1900s. In some ways, that's sort of a long time ago. So I'll start talking about how some of the biases that developed in those years have sort of unraveled in more recent years. So the first part of our talk, I'll start by talking a little bit more about tropical orioles and elaborate coloration. I'll talk about female song, starting with orioles, but then moving to blackbirds and across all songbirds, and talk about this recent study we've done on authorship. And the people at the conversation came up with this very good title, Women Disrupt Research on Bird Song. But in part two, we'll switch to talking more about the ecological work we've done on the Bahama oriole. But both that grant and an NSF International Research Experience for Student grants and this NSF NRT grant we've gotten, both of those are really focused on increasing ethnic diversity of those doing research in ecology, evolution, and environmental science. So that's really two parts of the talk, but they do all hopefully tie together about the theme of the importance of diversity and the need to increase diversity in ecology, evolution, and environmental science. So here are these three widespread temperate breeding orioles. I mentioned the Baltimore oriole from the Northeast United States. The orchard oriole is another species we have in the Northeast United States. If you pull a feather off of any orchard oriole from Maryland, as long as it's an adult male or a female, I can tell you which sex it came from. Every single feather, it has a different coloration on the male than on the female. In the Western United States, you have Bullock's oriole. And in all these cases, the females do sing some. We've documented females singing in the orchard oriole pretty much for the first time this year. There have been some recordings before, but either way, the song is much reduced or quite different. So we sort of, if you grew up in this part of the world, or in Northern Europe, or even in temperate parts of the world and other parts of the world, you might think of these as pretty typical songbirds. But the majority of the world's songbirds are tropical species. For example, in North America, we have about 5 species of orioles, whereas there's 35 species in the genus, and the majority of orioles, the majority of species in this genus are tropical. It's largely a Mexican genus that probably arose in Mexico about 5, 8, 10 million years ago. There's some species in the Caribbean, then some species have radiated out to South America as well. So most of these tropical orioles, or all of these tropical orioles, are to a large degree monochromatic. They're sexually monomorphic in coloration. You can't tell the males and females apart with binoculars, and even for the most part, if you do careful spectral measurements using whatever technique you use, there's no way to statistically distinguish the males from the females. They're not diagnostically different. And that the females sing in most of these species as well, including some of the species that have elaborate duets, coordinated duets between the males and the females. Now, for much of my career, I really focused, for the first 15 years at UMBC, focused a lot on these evolutionary trees, these phylogenies, and how they can be used to study character evolution. So here we have an evolutionary tree of a hypothetical genus of birds, let's say, with 4 species. So 3 of these species are gray. 1 of these species has elaborate orange coloration. So let's say this is the common ancestor of all orioles about 5 million years ago. Various lineages diverge through speciation. Most of those lineages hold on to that gray coloration, but this lineage, somewhere in here, has evolved this elaborate coloration, this orange coloration. So that's the gain of coloration. And so a lot of sexual selection studies are assuming this part of the picture, trying to figure out how and when males gained elaborate coloration. So there's no female part of the picture here. The females are completely ignored. If we do add a female part of the picture, the females are frequently assumed to be evolutionarily passive. So here, all females in all 4 of these species have cryptic coloration, this more gray coloration. The common ancestor of all orioles, or this hypothetical genus, had gray coloration, and that's been maintained in all of the species. So we get this gain of sexual dimorphism, dichromatism, is due to a change in males. But you could also end up with this sexual dimorphism not due to a change in males, but due to a change in females. So here again, we have here's a situation where the common ancestor of this genus had elaborate coloration in the males at the origin of the genus and has maintained that in all these species. Similarly, here's the common ancestor of the genus in the females, had elaborate orange coloration, and that's been maintained in most of these lineages. But this elaborate coloration, a loss of coloration, I'll put it simplistically, elaborate coloration has occurred in this lineage. So in this lineage, we have a sexually dimorphic, color dimorphic, dichromatic species, but it's due to a change in the females. And a lot of the dichromatism we see in orioles and in tanagers and in other songbirds is in many cases due to a change in the female. So like I said, many of these North American songbirds likely evolved from elaborate monochromatism and tropical ancestors. So here's a pair of species of oriole we studied in Veracruz, Mexico back in 2007 to 2010. And so I'm holding the male, my PhD, or one of my undergraduate students is holding the female. You can't tell the two apart. Somewhere in there, we began to think about thinking about female song, and the same sort of thing could be going on with song. So we sort of assume that what's happened when we're studying the evolution of song, we're studying a change in the males. So here's the common ancestor that just had some sort of call system, did not have a complex learned song, but that has evolved recently in this lineage. So here's a species in which the males have elaborate vocalizations, but the females lack it. So you might think when you're looking at a Baltimore oriole, aha, the male recently gained that elaborate vocalization that the female doesn't have. But the opposite is possible in song work as well. So the common ancestor had song in the males, the common ancestor had song in the females, and this absence of song or this greatly reduced song could be due to a change in the females. So let me go back there. I didn't focus on that. So here's this pretty typical definition of bird song. Songs are complex vocalizations produced by males during the breeding season. So that's sort of assuming that a lot of the change is really sort of focuses the evolutionary story on what's happening in the males. Whereas it could be a lot of the changes happening in the females. And so as work on orioles and more broadly other blackbirds, working with Jordan Price, I'll mention Jordan again soon, and Scott Lanyon, showing that female song was ancestral in orioles and most other blackbirds. So female song evolved millions of years ago at least, or probably longer ago than that. But the common ancestor of these groups had female song that has been lost or reduced. So this traditional definition of birdsong that I just mentioned is likely a biased definition, and we believe that the bias is in part caused by the geographic location of the birds being studied. Also, the geographic location of the researchers and what birds they're seeing in their backyards, what birds they grew up seeing, and also the gender of the researchers. So here's this classic definition of birdsong. Songs are complex vocalizations produced by the males in the breeding season. Now, Catchpole and Slater have sort of refined that definition a little bit, and they know that's partly a simplistic definition. But this definition, again, by two European men back in the 1900s, assumes that most birdsong evolution is happening in males. As a number of women began to sort of focus on birdsong, and in particular focus on birdsong in some tropical species in which female song was common, people like Naomi Langmore, and I had the pleasure of doing a sabbatical in Australia at Australian National University and was able to work down the hall from Naomi for a year. And Naomi writes that a historical bias toward behavioral studies in the temperate Northern Hemisphere has led to the perception that female song is rare and anomalous, rare and unusual. So when we start to think that way, you start to think, well, maybe does most birdsong evolution involve females as well? What is the role of female change, evolutionary change in females? And so at that time along came an excellent PhD student who joined my group and earned her PhD in 2016 from UMBC. And early in her time, she was able to get one of these marvelous NSF summer fellowships to go to Australia and work with Naomi to study the evolution of female song across all songbirds. And Karen worked with Naomi as well as Michelle Hall in Australia and Katarina Riebel in the Netherlands. And their work showed that female song was present in 71% of the species they surveyed for that study. So during the survey, we thought we were going to find that Karen and all those of us working with her would find pretty high levels of female song, but this level was even surprising to us. And so Karen was able to use these methods of ancestral state reconstruction, so use a phylogeny of all songbirds and show that female song was present in lots and lots of these species in these red lineages, and that red, or female song present in both sexes, was probably the condition, the character in the common ancestor of all songbirds. So that was songbirds evolved in Australia roughly 50 million years ago. And so it seems very likely, roughly 92% likelihood that female song was present in that common ancestor. So the old focus is really very much on males. Why did bird song evolve in males? But we have a new question here. Why did song evolve in both sexes? So song probably originally evolved in both sexes. So there likely was some function that was present in both sexes. So this is a really new paradigm for the original evolution of bird song. And also for people studying temperate zone species or any species without female song, why was female song lost or diminished in some of these species? So during the course of this research, we realized that a lot of the key people doing this research were women. There were some really key papers by Susan Faribaugh in 1982, Naomi Langmore in 1998, and I would argue that Karen's paper 2014 was an important paper in there. Now, there have been men doing work during this time as well, including, I mentioned, Jordan Price, who's done a lot of work on this, and Jordan Price is at St. Mary's College of Maryland and happens to be a spousal connection to Liz Price at the Chesapeake Biological Lab. So I don't know if Liz or her colleagues are on the call, but so this is our very own Maryland Jordan Price. But bottom line is most of the key papers were written by women. And so we began to ask ourselves, are women more likely to study female song? And so we set out to ask that question. And this research was led by a UMBC undergraduate. She graduated last year, 2019, named Casey Haynes. And she worked with my former PhD student, now Dr. Evangeline Rose, who's a postdoc now at University of Maryland College Park. And so Casey assembled all the female song articles she could find for this 20-year period, 97 to 2016. Any articles that had female song or female singing in the title or in the abstract. And then she found papers basically from the same journals, same or nearby years that were matched. So if there was a bird song article in the journal Animal Behavior or a female song article in Animal Behavior, she'd find a female song article, a bird song article in Animal Behavior. So she had 59 papers in this matched control data set. And so are women more likely to study female song? Let's look first at these first authors. That's sort of perhaps the number we were most interested in. And indeed, while a majority of the bird song papers were first authored by men, a majority of the female song papers were first authored by women. And so women were 24% more likely to study female song, 24% more likely to be first authors on these papers. And that's statistically significant. So Casey's paper just came out in Animal Behavior about a month ago. And we've been able to write a paper for the conversation about a news piece, commentary piece, that talks about this work and sort of what we think are the general implications for all science, all academia, and maybe even the Sierra Club or Google can pay some attention to the importance of gender diversity. So now what about who is leading the research groups? And indeed, we find a similar effect, although only 27% of the authors of bird song, the final authors of bird song papers are women. 42% of the female song papers have women as final authors. But still, the majority of the researchers who are in that period of 97 to 2016, the majority of the researchers were men, both in general birdsong papers and in female song papers. So there's a tendency for gender to be associated with research subject, but not significant here. So it's common to have women be a much smaller percentage of full professors than even in more equal fields. So for example, at UMBC, about 35, 38% of the of the assistant professors are women. And I think in ornithology, that's more or less the case, we're coming closer to equal representation in the early stages of careers. But at UMBC, for example, only 14% of our full professors are women. I looked up some data on the geosciences. It's very similar sort of thing. So clearly, to have the full benefits of gender diversity, we need to have more women in higher ranks. And I think that it's really important that the structural impact, the way structural aspects of PNT occur and throughout our fields, that those things need to be looked at. So to conclude this part of the talk, for the first 100 to 200 years of birdsong research, really since Darwin at least, it's really been dominated by people from Northern Europe and temperate parts of the United States. And this new generation of researchers, especially women, doing research in the 1980s and 1990s led to increasing recognition of the importance of female song. And recent work has really completely overturned our understanding of the original evolution of birdsong. So I would argue this is a paradigm shift that's really facilitated by and directly caused by the women that started doing this research. So in the old question, we might have asked, why did males originally evolve song, and really focused on male competition? Whereas the new question is, why did females and males originally evolve song? And a lot of there's many functions of female song and of duetting, but a lot of them really focus on both sexes working together year round, competing for territories with other pairs. So it's really a very different way of thinking about the original evolution of birdsong. So the take-home message is who we are, where we are from, the experiences we've had can really influence the science that we do. And so I bring my biases, you bring your biases. If we can come from different angles and from different backgrounds, we can approach scientific questions differently, use different methods, approach different kinds of questions, and make progress. So more diverse groups of researchers may tackle a greater diversity of questions, utilize more diverse methods and conceptual approaches, and really lead to advances that might not have occurred otherwise. And so this research on female song, we believe, provides a dramatic example of the important diversity for progress in all scientific research. So I did think that was potentially, that's the work on female song and on authorship. And I did think I'd stop and give people to ask, the opportunity to ask a few questions about this part of the research if you wanted to at this point. At the very least, I can get myself a little drink here.
This is Rose Jagus from IMET. Hi, Kevin.
Hi,
why do you think that more northerly birds in temperate habitats have lost the ability to sing and have lost the bright coloration?
Thanks for that. I don't think we have great solid data on any species, any one species. But I think the most likely scenario I view at this point is that female birds would bear the cost, or any bird would bear the cost of having elaborate coloration, regardless of where you live to some degree. Mm-hmm. So that there are accipiter predators, there are snake predators. If you're on the ground and there's a cat or a coyote, that elaborate coloration is a cost that either a male or a female would bear. And that's whether you're in the Bahamas or in Maryland. And similarly, if you're singing loudly, that's potentially a cost for predators, potentially a cost in terms of energy, and that's a cost that's present whether you're there in Maryland or in the Bahamas or Mexico. So I think the cost there's reason to believe that the cost could be present in both places. But in terms of the benefit, that the female Bahama oriole, we think they hold territories year-round. We need to nail that down. We know, for example, in the troupials, which is an oriole we've studied in Puerto Rico, the male and the female work together year-round. The female sings a lot in the non-breeding season along with the male. They duet year-round, and both sexes are working together to maintain territories year-round. And there might be other benefits. So a female Baltimore oriole really won't benefit in that way. She has very little role in territory defense. The male, for that matter, is only holding a territory for probably literally a matter of weeks. And the female doesn't have any benefit or has a much lower benefit to that elaborate coloration or that elaborate song in the temperate zone. So, but hopefully our group and other groups can continue to tackle those details. In fact, Jordan Price has a great paper showing that whenever you leave tropical monogamy, so if you leave tropical monogamy by becoming migratory, you lose female song. If you become a brood parasite like a cowbird, you lose female song. If you become polygamous like an oripendula, you lose female song. So the benefit to these traits seems especially there in monogamous species, probably with long-term pair bonds. Thanks.
So you think that the duetting is part of maintaining a strong pair bond?
Sure, maintaining the pair bond and especially the duetting in the oriole or the troupials we study in Puerto Rico, we think has a lot to do with that working together to, this pair is duetting over on this hillside and this pair is duetting over on this hillside, holding onto their various patches of cactus with fruit that might be absolutely crucial in the dry season, for example. So great, we can certainly ask more questions about the authorship or the female song at the end, but otherwise I will dive in and tell you about some of our research on the ground with the Bahama oriole. So this is a critically endangered species. It's found only in a single island of the Bahamas. And so we've been doing student research projects, especially undergraduate research projects for the last 5 years. And we now have a NSF International Research Experience for Students grants, IRES. And a major goal of that grant is to increase the diversity of students able to do research in ecology, evolution, conservation, biology. So the Caribbean is one of the globally recognized biodiversity hotspots. There are 22 threatened songbird species in the Caribbean. So the threats include predators such as introduced feral cats, cowbirds, which pretty much have spread through the Caribbean on their own, but they're sort of a non-native species. We've got hurricanes. The strength of hurricanes is not native to the Caribbean. We have arguments that good evidence that hurricanes are strengthening. And of course we have sea level rise. So for some of these islands, the low islands of the Bahamas in particular, sea level rise is a really existential threat for the country and for a number of the species on the low-lying islands. So there are 8 endemic orioles found in these islands. On the Greater Antilles, there are species, for example, in Puerto Rico that are considered of least concern. And there's several that are threatened or near threatened or vulnerable in the Lesser Antilles. And in the Bahama orioles considered critically endangered. So the Bahama oriole is now restricted just to Andros. So Andros is a very, sort of thought of as a single island. I think of this as a single island endemic, but it's really made up of 3 major islands and then hundreds of other smaller islands. So now the Bahama oriole is just restricted to Andros. It was formerly found on the island of Abaco. So here's Abaco, a little to the north of Andros. It was the one that really got nailed first by Hurricane Dorian last year. So it was extirpated from Abaco, and we don't know why. So that's one of the main things that causes me and others interested in this species to be worried. If you know who the killer is, you can defend yourself. But here we don't really know. Was it a disease? Was it cowbirds? Was it a bad hurricane? We don't think it was a bad hurricane. Was it cats? We don't really know why it left, what caused its extirpation from Abaco. So that's why one of the reasons we think our work on Andros is absolutely crucial. So there had been previous research done on the oriole, a PhD student working at Loma Linda University, working from 2006 to 2009. And that group of researchers focused, really it's the PhD student and one or two assistants, you know, for a few months here and a few months there. And they really focused on settlements along the east coast of Andros. And they called the Bahama oriole a synanthropic species that was basically commensal with humans in developed areas. And they found almost all the nests they found were in coconut palms. So here's an introduced coconut palm, coconut likely introduced by the Spaniards, you know, 300, 500 years ago. And so a lot of the nests, almost all the nests that were found by that group were in these coconut palms. And they also estimated the number of orioles on the island and estimated that there were only something in the order of 140 to 250 left. But they didn't use rigorous ecological statistical sampling methods. They didn't use distance sampling or in any other way quantify detectability. And they really didn't have sufficient resources, time, money, people, to spend time out in these extensive pine forests. So all the settlements are along the East Coast, and these pine forests extend many kilometers away from the roads and are very inaccessible. Even the logging roads are inaccessible to some degree. So the first thing we did was we dove into the pine forest. Rather, I sent undergraduates into the pine forest. Literally, that's true to some degree. So this was an amazing team in 2016 of a young Bahamian scientist, Laurent Roll, and a UMBC junior at the time, Daniel Stonko. And they worked together. They called each other Stalker and Tracker. And Laurent found the first nest in the pine forest period up in a pine tree. When he emailed me and told me he'd found a nest in a pine tree, I didn't believe it. I didn't think orioles would nest in a pine tree. We have now found quite a few nests in pine trees. About half the nests we find in the pine forest are indeed in pine trees. And then about a week later, Daniel, working with him, was able to find two nests in these thatch palms. So these are key thatch palms, Leucothrinax mauricii. And so this is sort of as if you're looking up inside an umbrella. This nest right here, I'm pointing with my finger, this nest right here is sort of hidden in underneath these hanging palm fronds. And so we've now found many nests in the pine forest. So this paper just documenting initially our finding of nests in the pine forest was published in 2018 with an undergraduate lead author, Dan Stonko. So the next thing we wanted to know was, are orioles choosing specific sites in the pine forest? Is pine forest equal pine forest? Are there specific types of pine forests, very tall pine trees, very scattered pine trees? What about the pine? Are there certain parts of the pine forest that could be crucial to the oriole survival and especially nesting? And so this work was done by another UMBC undergraduate, Brianna Yancey. She was a student in our well-known Meyerhoff Scholars Program. And so she compared actual nest sites to random plots that were 50 and 100 meters from the actual nest site. So she studied the micro scale, what's going on in the nest tree in the closest nests, what's happening at a mesoscale within 10 meters of the nest, and what's happening at what we call the macro scale, vegetation out to 100 meters away from the nest tree. So at the micro scale, she showed that the thatch palms that the birds nested within were significantly taller than the other thatch palms in the area. She didn't find any significant effects at the mesoscale at sort of the 10-meter radius, but at 100-meter radius, the orioles were choosing nests to nest in areas that had significantly more tall thatch palms. So here's a 7 or 8 meter tall key thatch palm that Brianna is measuring versus these small thatch palms in the understory. So not surprisingly, they're nesting in these tall thatch palms. They probably forage in these tall thatch palms. So having tall thatch palms in the forest is probably crucial for the orioles, or at least makes they seem to be more likely to nest in those areas. And I put Yancey et al. Accepted because just this week, Brianna found that, that her Firthoster manuscript has been accepted in Journal of Caribbean Ornithology, and so hopefully it will come out sometime next year. Our next question was, are there really only 140 or 250 left? You know, is it this, when I first started to work on this species, I felt like I might be on board to be the guy, or our research group would be there to document its demise over the next, 10, 20, 30 years. But once we got to the island, we realized they're out in the pine forest, and pretty much anywhere we went in the pine forest, we would hear and see them occasionally. So we did a very rigorous study on these remote logging roads throughout the pine forest. We did a total of 467 point counts, had a total of 75 detections. So the detections are shown here in white, whereas the non-detections are the black dots. So yes, we did find some birds in these settlements on the East Coast or along the roadways, but a lot of the detections were out here in the far west or the far south of the study site, out in these pine forests, 5, 10 kilometers at least from the nearest settlement. And so using hierarchical distance sampling, my former undergraduate, now just finished a master's at Villanova, Rick Stanley, did a lot of the work with us too. He just finished a master's at Imperial College London. And so they've written a manuscript that we've just gotten back from Avian Conservation and Ecology with a lot of good comments. So we think we'll have that accepted in a few months if things go well. But something in the order are the distance sampling, hierarchical distance sampling estimate between 1,200, 2,800 individuals roughly. So that's just in our study site. That's just in this northern, say, 1/5 of the island. It does contain some of the biggest chunk of pine, but we think across the whole island, there might be something on the order of certainly several thousand, maybe 3,000, 5,000. We really don't have any rigorous estimate, but we do think it's something in the order of 10, 30, 50 times as many as the earlier estimates had been. So that's very good news for the Orioles. So, so far, several pieces of good news. Another piece of good news is we wanted to know if these shiny cowbirds, so these are nest parasites that lay their eggs, so probably 2 or 3 of these eggs are Oriole nests and the other 3 or 4 of these eggs are cowbirds. Here's a cowbird. We have many situations where a single cowbird fledged from a nest and no Orioles fledged. So the Orioles have fed the young cowbirds and reduced the fitness of that pair of Orioles, or perhaps in that given year, reduced it to 0. So this is work led by Sierra Barkdahl. She just graduated. She's working here with one of the lead science officers for Bahamas National Trust, Scott Johnson. And so relatively small sample size at this point, but with just 22 nests or 21 nests, 0%, none of the nests in undeveloped pine forests were parasitized, whereas 82% of the nests we found in developed areas were parasitized. So this makes sense. The cowbirds are foraging largely, and they're called cowbirds. They're out in these grasslands and agricultural areas and around human settlements. So we seldom see them in the pine forest, and so far we have not found any nests in the pine forest parasitized. So that's another good piece of good news. Sierra has an excellent manuscript that hopefully we'll submit in the next month or two, Journal of Field Ornithology. So those are the biggest student projects that are sort of gotten to some stage of completion, but we have some preliminary data from other student projects that have told us some really important things. So this is Sheridan Donqua. He was part of the International Research Experience for Students group in 2019. So he just graduated and just a couple of weeks ago started as a first-year dental school at a little school called Harvard. If I'm not mistaken, he's going to be one of 2 African-American students in the dental school at Harvard. So he's going to be a great dentist and is really, I think, going to have disproportional impacts, even bigger than that smile. Sheridan was an outstanding person to work with. And so he led the radio tracking effort. We had radio tracking equipment in the lab. And I just said, Sheridan, it's been years since we've used this. Can you figure out how to use it? Let's order some radios, figure out what kind of radios to order. And so he really led that effort. We had a hard time catching Orioles, so we only got radios on 3 Orioles last year. But every one of those Orioles moved around way more than I had imagined. So I've been out there in these forests chasing these Orioles for the last 4 or 5 years, and I had no sense that, so these, here's a pair where the nest hatched here, and 3 days later, Sheridan and I found them with fledglings, more than a half a kilometer away. So these territories are anywhere from 0.2 to 0.5 square kilometers. And that's really 5 to 10 times larger than I was envisioning it. And it's quite a few times larger than the territories of other Orioles that have been studied. So just with a few birds, Sheridan has sort of changed my impression of what's going on out there. And we have a PhD student who's going to do more tracking. We also had a woman named Brianna Bird do work on cats, and had a systematic array of cats that she put out there in 2019. And based on recognizing individual cats, for example, these 3 prominent stripes on the right rear leg of this cat that's present and visible from this quite different angle. So she's pretty sure she had 5 or 7 cats that she individually recognized. So that implies something on the order of 1 cat per square kilometer. The size of Andros, there are probably thousands of feral cats on Andros. And we definitely have seen them in remote places. That this is probably 3 or 5 kilometers from the nearest settlement. And we've definitely seen them in more remote places. And she also has pictures of 2 of the cats were moving around with kittens. So those are the cutest little invasive predators I've ever seen. But the cats are reproducing in the pine forest. So that's probably a huge deal for Orioles. Here it is. Here's a native frog being carried by that cat. So clearly it's probably a big deal for lizards and snakes and other native wildlife as well. And then the last project we've made some big progress on is developing a habitat classification map for Andros. This has been led by my PhD student, Janine Antalfi. Janine's also doing some conservation genetic work. And so most of this island is inaccessible. It's really vast wilderness. It's the size of the state of Delaware, and probably no human beings have walked out in parts of this island. It's very difficult to move around in coral rock and wetlands and so on. But Janine's work has enabled us to quantify that there are big chunks of pine forest out in these remote areas. And we know there are Orioles in at least some of these remote areas. So that's more good news for the Oriole. And as I mentioned, I have a new PhD student, Michelle Moyer, who's going to be doing more tracking and really working out around the full annual cycle use of the pine forest and use of territories. Are the females singing year-round? Do they hold territories year-round? Do the pair stay in the pine forest, or they leave to other habitats in the non-breeding season? And basically, an overall theme of Michelle's work: can our knowledge of female behavior, female song, female ecology, what will that bring to the species that we wouldn't have had if we just focused on the males? Most blatantly, if we assume that it's only males are singing, and we go out there and count the population, we're going to vastly overestimate the population, perhaps by a factor of 2, if the females are doing half the singing. So she will work on nailing all that down. And so again, this has been a National Science Foundation grant, international research experience for students. And a major goal of the grant is increasing the diversity of the students' interest in ecology, evolution, and conservation. So we've been able to benefit from UMBC's diverse student body. We've also been able to bring in recent transfer students, and about half the students who go on the trip have had to get passports. This gentleman right here, he'd never been on a plane before he got to go to Andros, so his second flight ever was in the co-pilot seat of one of these little puddle jumpers we take to get over to the island of Andros. So we've had amazing collaboration with Bahamas National Trust. This is Scott Johnson, who's done a lot of work with us, BNT, as we call them, has recently hired an avian ecologist that we work with, and the lead science officer at BNT has been spectacular. So we're off to a good start. Now there's 2 PhD projects, and we have more funding to bring students back each of the next 2 years. Fingers crossed, who knows whether we'll be able to go to Andros next year or not. I would like to wrap up just with 3 slides to talk about and to advertise our new master's program focused at UMBC. We have an NSF NRT grant. We call it iCare. So it's a master's degree focusing on broadening participation in all kinds of environmental science projects in and around the Baltimore Harbor. So that can be population ecology of the birds around the harbor or in wetlands. It can be nutrient balance in the harbor. It can deal with, sorry, I should have turned off my phone. So the PI in this work is Dr. Tamara Mendelson. People could email her or email me. I'm one of the co-PIs. So iCare, Interdisciplinary Consortium for Applied Research in the Environment. So it's a $2.8 million NSF training grant. We just put out the official call for applicants literally today. So we'll be accepting students for our first cohort in the fall of 2021. So if you know of students looking for a master's program, they will have stipends. And so that's one thing that will really be crucial to, we think, lowering the bar to participation from groups that might have been traditionally excluded. We believe that financial barriers and even the idea of, embarking on a 5-year PhD project for someone who's a recent immigrant or a first-generation college student, that a funded 2-year master's program may really be the bridge to bring in a more diverse graduate student population. So we have faculty from 5 UMBC departments, co-PIs from those departments. And so these research projects can be, as I said, a wide range of projects in and around the Baltimore Harbor. And the goal is to have students co-mentored by people at UMBC and by outside scientists. So we've already developed great partnerships with people who work for the U.S. Geological Survey, the Forest Service, Maryland DNR, Chesapeake Bay Foundation, other even students or rather researchers at different UMBC campuses. So for example, Colleen Burgee is one of the co-PIs who's at IMET. She's a UMBC faculty member, but obviously interacts with UMBC's faculty who are down at IMET. So our goal is to really recruit these underrepresented groups and really focused on getting students key workforce skills. And we do think this stipend is going to be really help bring in a wider diversity of students. So I'll wrap up with just talking about some of these overall themes, that the overall low diversity in ornithology, ecology, environmental science as a whole is an issue that I think it's really important to be working on, that this in part has led to a temperate zone bias in the research that's been done on color and birdsong. And so the increase in women studying birdsong has really helped lead to a paradigm shift. So the argument is more diverse researchers, more diverse approaches, more diverse questions being asked can lead to novel insights, rather than just continuing to hire older white men like me. So increasing faculty and researcher diversity can help us do better than everything that we do, whether it involves our research, whether it involves our teaching, whether it involves our outreach. So as I mentioned, I've been fortunate enough to serve as a Stride Faculty Diversity Fellow for the last 5 years. That's been super exciting. And I was able to meet with a number of UMBC's leaders and personnel about a year ago as part of our UMBC team. And so hoping to continue those conversations. Wrap up with quick acknowledgements. Again, Bahamas National Trust has been an amazing collaborator all along. Thanks for funding from NSF. And then the work I've talked about has really been driven by Karen Odom, Dr. Evangeline Rose, my new PhD student, Michelle Moyer. I mentioned, that's the work on female song. I mentioned Janine Antalfi, and then this undergraduate, Casey Haynes. So please, if you have other questions, I look forward to it. Thanks for your attention.
Big virtual clap. Thanks, Kevin. Please, I'll just hold off a minute and see if anyone wants to chime in, and then there's at least one question in the chat I can read.
This is Rose Jagus again from IMET. Kevin, you may or may not know that I run a summer undergraduate internship program at IMET for minority students. I've done it for pretty much 20 years.
Wonderful.
And I hadn't realized what you would, this wonderful example of how diversity in the scientists resulted in a paradigm shift in how we saw coloration and song in birds. So I would love to, I ran the program as a virtual program this summer, and I would have loved to have invited you to speak to my students about this. But
I'd be happy to in a future year, and this is hot off the presses. The conversation piece just came out a week ago, and the journal Animal Behavior paper just came out 2 weeks ago. But I know about some of the UMBC students who have done research at IMET over the summer, and I suspect some of those were students in your program, and we're really eager to have anyone interested in that master's program to. We've sent the notice out to all our
former undergraduates.
That's wonderful. Thank you, Rose.
But I think Eamon Raza has worked with you and maybe was hoping to go to the Bahamas this summer. She was in my program in 2019.
Yeah, I should. Eamon is a spectacular researcher. She is so driven. In our lab meeting, she asks questions every single time. And she is,
she actually had a position with C-Stream, the C-Stream program this summer.
Yes.
And was working with the scientists down at the Smithsonian.
I'd love to give someone a chance to ask Kevin a question about some of the...
Sorry.
That's okay. No, it's great.
So, but Eamon happens to, she's very aware of her own, that she would be a pioneer, and that people who look like her are not out there doing a lot of bird research, and she's very aware of that and really eager to play that role. She happens to be president of UMBC Greenpeace. So she's, not only eager to be a great scientist, but she's already a great environmental activist.
I have a question. Oh, someone else go?
Go ahead, Kat.
This is Kat Stalinsky, and I'm really impressed with what you're doing, and would love to see, and of course what Rose is doing, would love to see UMCs do more. I was curious to ask, this great example in your studies with songbirds, but if you have thought about or had discussions about or read about other areas of ecology where we see this gender bias, either in terms of gender of species or in terms of other work. I wondered if you had other examples that as you thought about this, that you've looked elsewhere in ecology.
I haven't thought about it too much, but for example, we cite some of these in the Animal Behavior article. Close to home for us, it was women who sort of first caused people working on bird extra-pair fertilizations to say, wait a minute, maybe it's not the males forcing copulations, maybe the females are seeking extra-pair copulations. So Bridget Stutchbury and Patty Gawadi were key in heading in that direction. In primatology, Jane Goodall, Diane Fossey, and Brute Galdikas were chosen because they're women, because Louis Leakey thought they would be capable, they wouldn't be stuck in the old dogmas, and so they would be able to create new paradigms without the baggage of the old primatologists. A woman by the name of Ruth Bennett is an ecologist at the Smithsonian Migratory Bird Center, and she is, really focusing on, I believe, some of her work at least has talked about the wintering ecology of females, and for example, females are probably limiting population growth in many species of songbirds, so the habitats that females in may be the most crucial to conservation. So those are a few examples, and I'd love to hear more and get people thinking about other examples.
I think, did you have a question, Luke?
Yeah, I was wondering about potential management. Well, first of all, so the shiny cowbirds aren't that present in the pine forest where there's more. Did you do some sort of estimate of population viability? The number, if there's more of them there and there aren't as many shiny cowbirds, does that answer the question of can they sustain themselves? And if it is potentially threatened in some way, would cowbird management potentially be necessary or considered or an option? Because that was certainly important for the recovery of golden cheek warblers and Kirtlands.
Right. So, like Kirtland's warbler, I'm assuming that the Kirtland's warblers had access to, or rather the brown-headed cowbird has access to 100% of the Kirtland's nest. I don't know the system that well, but we're sort of thinking they really only have, easy access to, 5, 10, 20% of the oriole nests. And so we think that things that are threats in the pine forest, perhaps cats, perhaps not enough habitat with these tall thatch palms, that could be more crucial. But we really do not have, I would love a collaborator that would help take us to the next level with a full-on population viability analysis. And right at this point, I think we're missing some of the key parameters. We don't have, we haven't tracked enough nests to know what percentage of nests fledge versus fail and how many on average and so on. But that's definitely would be a good next step for the species. Because IUCN is thinking of, downlisting them. So having more data before they were downlisted would be very useful.
I have one question from the chat, and then, okay. I mean, some people will probably have to go because it's after 5, but we can keep talking a little bit longer as long as people can stay. But anyway, so the question in the chat was regarding the radiotelemetry work, and you found that the birds move much further than you expected. And it was in relation to the recent paper of long distance movements during breeding, again, Kirtland's warblers. And the question is that a bias also? Are birds moving a lot further than we expect and from their typical range? And if so, where would this bias come from?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. You can sort of easily imagine that if you've got your bird banded on its territory and you go there to find it, right? And when you find it there, it's there. And if it moves hundreds of meters away, perhaps even outside your study site, you don't really know. So that clearly could be something that could cause a bias. So we're pretty excited about a next generation technology. I don't know if anyone in the audience knows anything about it. Cellular CTT, cellular tracking technology, a group out of a company out of Cape May, New Jersey, and the couple breakthrough technologies with them. For one, the trackers are solar, so they can last a long time, which for us is crucial because we want to know what a bird is doing in the breeding season, let's say, in June, and be able to know what's going on in December and January. And lots of conventional radio collars the batteries would be running out. And then they have sensors that are constantly monitoring the bird, and those are also solar powered. So we feel like that's a real great game changer for those of us interested in species with, year-round residence. So we can use this tracking technology to know, in theory, where a female is 365 days a year. So we need to get that off the ground, but we're pretty excited about that.
Well, that's cool. So you're going to set up a whole network of the nodes and everything down there.
Yeah, we'll start with a small network, and if we had resources and/or collaborators, we can go bigger. But we're pretty excited.
I think Claire had a question also.
Yeah, I was just going to ask, kind of tying into that question about specifically about tracking them. I feel like, thinking about some of my fieldwork experiences, having a lot of challenges trying to catch females because they're just so much less responsive to playback and they're less territorial. And I'm wondering if you have the same issues because you have both sexes that sing and potentially defend territories. Does that enable you to potentially catch more females? Obviously, like not knowing necessarily in the hand, or maybe when you do get them in the hand, I don't know if both, I assume that maybe just females incubate. But anyway, does that potentially allow for better information on like female movement and, that are limited in other species because it's just so hard to catch females?
Yeah, unfortunately, both sexes of orioles are pretty hard to catch. They like to be up in treetops, so getting them down low enough, whether that's in Puerto Rico or the Bahamas or Maryland. So they're always hard to catch. The Bahama oriole females, they're a little harder to catch than the males, but not a ton. And with the low nests in these satch palms, we have been able to just put up the nets next to nests and catch males and females that way. So, so we're optimistic we'll be able to know what females are doing. Throughout the annual cycle.
Yeah, I spent a fall banding birds in Switzerland up at the Col de Bretellé, just where the finches come through. And we had mist nets on telescoping poles. So we would put them up, before dawn and wind them down later. And we caught a lot of birds. Of course, there were a lot of birds to be caught, but I don't know whether you've tried anything like that.
We have in Puerto Rico, we had 40-foot bamboo that we but having the right telescoping metal object to do that would help us. So you and I should stay in touch about a bunch of stuff here.
Well, I think we should probably call it. It's a little bit after 11, after 11 minutes after 5, unless anyone has any last questions. But thank you so much, Kevin. This was really greatly appreciated and a really lovely seminar, and we had a nice turnout. And so I hope you also enjoyed it.
And thanks for advertising it so well, you guys.
Good deal. Well, it's great to chat with everyone, and I appreciate the opportunity. And I do see not only is Elizabeth Price on the call, but Dr. Jordan Price was also there to hear him talk. To hear him used as the token male in this research, I told him I would do that. So nice to talk to everybody. Thanks a lot.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you.